So our speaker is Dr. Randy Pruim from Calvin University. I first met Randy probably at a choir rehearsal in 1984. We sang in both campus choir and capella over the years during our undergrads. We both did math majors while we were there, but he also had a second major in German and subsequently earned his PhD in mathematics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And not long after began his work at Calvin, which is now Calvin University. At the time it was Calvin College. And in his more than 2 decades at the university, he's taught extensive numbers of courses, most recently focusing on statistics, particularly courses in which R is used extensively. In fact, he's written a book about teaching statistics with R, so I encourage you to check that out as well. Along the way, he did some additional study at University of Michigan related to statistics, so he may share some thoughts on that as well. He currently serves as our department chair, has been so for the last 8 years. And let's see, what else did I want to say? I think I'll leave it there. So I turn it over to Randy Pruim. Welcome.
All right, if I've done things correctly, you should now be able to see my screen. Can someone confirm that that's correct?
I can confirm.
Excellent, thank you. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm sorry that this is under the unusual circumstances of COVID and that we're talking to screens and not able to meet in person. But I am glad that we still get a chance to have this conversation of sorts tonight. The title of my talk, Random Thoughts, has sort of a double meaning. I'm going to talk about randomness, so that's one of the things there. And the other is that I'm going to share a collection of thoughts. They're not really random. I selected them with some reason, some rhyme and reason, but some of them may appear a little bit random to you as we go along. So it's this odd collection of thoughts about randomness leading up to some big and fairly hard questions that I want to muse about a little bit toward the end. A few caveats before we begin. First, there's no dinner after this talk. Normally, this is a before dinner talk. In the old days, it was a dinner where we met all in one room and the speaker usually spoke in that room just before the dinner was served. And then more recently, we've been splitting up into smaller groups and going together to dinner after the presentation. And despite the fact that we don't all get to go to dinner together afterwards, although I guess you're welcome to Zoom to your friends and have dinner together that way, I'm going to give a sort of pre-dinner style of talk. I saw that Mike Staub was on the list of attendees, and we were chatting once at a meeting years and years ago about what makes a good ACMS talk. And one of the things he said is it should be light enough that guests who are not mathematicians can still enjoy it. And so I hope there's enough in here that even if you're not a mathematician and you don't think about probability very often, you can still enjoy the talk. But no dinner, dinner's on your own. Most of this is going to be a collection of personal reflections, some stories that I'm going to tell about things related to my life and the ways that those have shaped the way that I think about randomness. But that's also fitting for a pre-dinner talk. The third caveat is that randomness is actually pretty hard and probably too hard an idea to cover as a pre-dinner talk. So it's going to be kind of a light view of a challenging topic. The anecdotes will hopefully help with that. There's multiple challenges in dealing with randomness. One of them is the technical challenge. If you've ever taught an introductory statistics course or probability course, you know that beginners find it difficult to learn the technical aspects of computing probabilities, especially when you get to more complicated things like conditional probabilities or joint distributions. So there are technical challenges. Those aren't going to be our primary challenges tonight. There's not going to be very much technical probability in this talk at all. There's vocabulary challenges and disciplinary challenges, and I'll put those two together because part of the problem is that the vocabulary isn't consistent across the disciplines. A number of years ago, I helped lead with a colleague in biology a faculty reading group on randomness with faculty mostly from Calvin University, but from a few other institutions nearby as well. And we spent a lot of time early on just narrowing our vocabulary to an extent that we could talk to each other and feel like we thought we mostly understood what the other person was saying. Anyway, hopefully that won't be too much of a stumbling block for the things I want to do here either. But if you want to pursue these ideas further, you'll find all three of these will be challenges to you. And then finally, this is maybe a quirk of me, but I found the conversations that we had around randomness very interesting, very stimulating, and simultaneously really frustrating. Frustrating because I felt like there was no methodology to answer the questions I really wanted to ask. They're not really questions about which you can prove something, so there's no theorems. They're not really questions where you can do data analysis. There's not really algorithms. So my three disciplines of mathematics, statistics, and computer science, while they bring something to the conversation, they don't settle the question. And it's not clear that the other disciplines that we invited to that reading group, philosophy, biology, physics, chemistry, it's not clear that any of them has the perfect methodology to answer these questions either, theology as well. So to some extent, I'm doing what some of my philosopher colleagues like to say, I'm scratching an itch. I'm not going to settle a matter, but hopefully get us to think some interesting thoughts about randomness. I'm going to say a little bit about what randomness is before I get started. When I teach about probability and randomness, I often ask my students what they think of as random. And almost always some students will come up with the idea of unpredictableness. They don't always use the word unpredictability, but the idea that they're describing is unpredictability. And we could think of that as a process randomness. I've got some process like flipping a coin. And if I toss the coin, that tossing of the coin is a random thing because I don't know before I toss the coin what the outcome of the coin will be. So I've got a coin here, I'm ready to flip it, and we've got a random process, and we don't know whether I'm going to get a head or a tail. All right, that's one kind of randomness, process randomness. There's another kind of randomness, and that's an unknowability. So let's suppose I flip this coin like I just did. I now know whether it's a head or a tail, but you don't. So is it still random? And what kind of a random is it? It's not about predictability anymore because there's nothing in the future going to happen. The coin has already been tossed. From my perspective, the matter is settled. I can tell what it is. From your perspective, it's just as unknown as it was before I tossed the coin. And if you were to model it mathematically, you would model it with the same probability, 50-50, assuming it's a fair coin, 50-50 chance of getting a head or a tail. But somehow it's different now in some way. And I'll call that unknowability. And even if we model that same way we would model it as if it were a process looking at it prospectively, even though it's in the past, we still model it the same way, but it's somehow different. Then there's a third kind of randomness. There may be others as well, but a third kind that I'll mention here, and that's incompressibility or descriptive randomness. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but if you've heard phrases like Kolmogorov complexity or Kolmogorov random, that's what this is about. And so let's look now at a sequence of coin tosses. So I've got T's and H's indicating tails and heads, so tail, tail, head, head, and so on. And I'd like to say something about this sequence and whether this sequence of heads and tails is random. And in fact, Kolmogorov complexity lets me quantify how random the sequence is. Now, it turns out this particular sequence is not super special, but it is concocted in a special way. And that'll be clearer if I show you a little bit more information. And now it's maybe clear that every other result is just a repetition of the one that came before it. So in some sense, this sequence is only half random. I actually got the tails and heads for the odd elements in this sequence by simulating a coin toss, and then I just duplicated them. So it's a random string, a random sequence of heads and tails, but it's not as random as one would be if I did the toss new each time. And another way to think about that is that I could describe the whole sequence to you just by telling you every other result. And in that sense, I can compress it into something much shorter. And the more I can compress something in this idea of compressibility or Kolmogorov randomness, the more I can compress it, the less random it is. And the most random things are the things that can only be described or cannot be described any more succinctly than to simply write down the sequence of outcomes. All right, so that's enough to make this be a math talk. We've said a little bit about some formal definitions. For the most part, we won't really need to know a lot about randomness for the questions I'm primarily interested in. So I want to start talking about some fun and games and stories related to the fun and games. A few notes about games, some things you need to know about games in general and about my relationship to games in particular. The first one is that I've always liked playing games. I don't really remember the first game I ever played. I really don't remember a time that I didn't play games. I remember early on playing games like Don't Spill the Beans and Don't Break the Ice and Candyland, and moving quickly to more complicated games. So I've always played games, and apparently this is hereditary. This is one of our game closets at my house. 2 of my 3 children have moved out, so our game collection has shrunk a little bit because of their moving out. Still, you can see we have quite a few games in our family. Some of those games, like that Stratego box that you can see there, are old. That was a game that was given to me as a gift as a middle schooler. So we've hung on to games for a long time. I think that Sorry game is quite old, as is the Monopoly game. Others are much newer. In fact, there were new games given to our family just this past Christmas. The second thing you need to know about our family is that in our family, if you play a game, you play to win, but lose gracefully. This includes when Dad plays games with his 2- and 3-year-old kids. Dad plays to win. This has some consequences. In particular, this has some consequences for what sorts of games are worth playing. And randomness can be used to balance the game. So you can think of a little spectrum of games in terms of how random or strategic they are. On the left end, some of those games I learned early on, War and Candyland, are just completely random. You flip over cards, you see what they tell you to do, you do the thing, and eventually somebody wins, but the players really had no control over anything. It was just a completely random game. And then you get games like Sorry. I'll say a little bit more about Sorry in a moment, but that game has randomness, this time via cards again. But there's also a choice because you have multiple pieces that you can move. And so there's some choice to the player about what piece gets moved based on the cards. And then games like Cribbage and Mitternachtsparty, which is a German game that was given to our family as a gift long ago. I'll refer to it as Hugo because there's a piece in the game named after the ghost Hugo. And that's what my kids grew up calling the game. They called it the Hugo game. And way on the far end, you have games like chess, where there's really no randomness at all. Although you could imagine introducing randomness into chess if you had 2 or 3 moves and you couldn't decide what to do, and you decided, I'll just roll a die or flip a coin to decide amongst these eligible moves, then you've introduced some randomness into chess. But typically, we think of chess as being a purely strategic game. So War and Candyland, they're really just slow ways to flip a coin. Both players are equally likely to win. You do a long drawn out process with lots of cards and moving pieces around, and eventually somebody wins, but neither of the players has any control. And it's not terribly interesting, except if you like to watch how the randomness evolves throughout the game. And I'm not going to talk much about games like that, except to say that it didn't take me long as a kid to figure out that this was pretty boring and to change the rules. And I'll talk about that in a little bit when I talk about Sorry. That's another game that I played as a young kid. In this game, you can see the multiple pieces of each color. You flip over a card. The card tells you how many spaces you may move, but the player gets to choose which piece they move. At least they can when they have more than one piece active in the game. Interestingly, when I was looking for a picture of Sorry online, I found this one, which I'm not sure what I think about this picture, because I thought I invented this idea as a young child, which is that the game would be much more fun if everybody had a hand of 5 or 6 cards. Every turn you could play a card and replace it. The game would still be random because you would be drawing to replenish this hand of cards, but it would be more strategic because you could choose which card to play and you could map out plans for 2 and 3 turns down the road. You could hang on to important cards until a key moment in the game, All things you couldn't do if you just flipped one card and did what that card said to do. And in fact, you can do the same thing with lots of other games. So when I was a kid, we played War with a hand, we played Candyland with a hand, anything to make the game a little bit less random and a little bit more strategic. Midnight Party, Hugo. There's the game board there. I need to tell you a little bit about this one just because it's a sad story in my life of playing games with my kids. Remember, I said dad plays to win. This game is interesting because as you can see that there's a die in this game, but on one of the sides of the die is printed a ghost. When the ghost is rolled, the ghost figure, Hugo, gets to move. When a number is rolled, a player gets to roll their piece. The game starts with Hugo down in the cellar, and the initial phase of the game involves the players deciding where to place their pieces around the promenade on the outside. Every time Hugo is rolled, Hugo comes up the stairs. When Hugo gets to the top of the stairs, then Hugo goes clockwise around the promenade, and if Hugo catches up to your person, you go to the cellar. And you can see in this picture, there are 3 people in the cellar. The worst score goes to the player who was caught first, and then second, and then third, and so on. There are rooms around the promenade, and you can duck into the rooms, but at most 1 person per room. Well, we're going to play this game for the first time, having received it as a gift. I did a quick probability calculation. On average, how often will Hugo show up? How many turns will it take before Hugo gets to the promenade? How many spaces will I have moved my characters before Hugo gets there? Where do I want them to be when Hugo starts gobbling things so that I've got plenty of time to duck into a room? You don't want to be right in front of Hugo or you'll get caught. You also don't want to be right behind Hugo, or you'll quickly pass up Hugo and then be right in front of Hugo and you'll be the next one to move down to the cellar. Great, so I figured this all out. I used this to plan my optimal strategy for placing my people. And then I got completely blown away by my kids. I came in last place and badly. And the reason is that I hadn't noticed that the die actually has 2 Hugos on it, not 1. They're on opposite sides, so you don't really see them both at the same time. And so I had worked with the probability of 1/6 of getting a Hugo, when in fact the probability was 1/3. It didn't take me long while playing the game to realize that Hugo was coming up too often. Interestingly, it didn't occur to me that there was another number that wasn't coming up at all. In any case, I lost badly because I made a bad probability calculation. My kids love the game, and they love the fact that they beat me on their first go. And I want to tell one more story about a game. This is Joseph Petrus Wergen. This is his Hall of Fame picture. He's in the Hall of Fame for cribbage. And he likes to tell a story about a time when he played cribbage with somebody who thought they were quite good at cribbage. And so to get back at them, while they were out of the room, he took all the 5s out of the deck. And you don't need to know much about cribbage except to know that the 5s are very important cards in cribbage, and you make lots of plans around the probabilities of 5s turning up. Not knowing what cards he would get, but knowing that he wouldn't get a 5 and that the other cards were equally likely, gave him a sufficient edge to win the game very handily. His opponent apparently didn't even notice that no 5s had come up in the entire game that they played. All right, so I bring that up for 2 reasons. One is that I want to talk a little bit about this changing the probabilities and how that can have an effect on something without knowing exactly how things turn out. But the other is that I want to start moving beyond games. And I want to tell you about Joe. It's the same picture, it's the same person, but I didn't know him as Joseph Petrus Wergen, which is how he's listed in the Cribbage Hall of Fame. I knew him as the guy who lived above me in graduate school. My first year in graduate school, he had the apartment above mine. My wife and I were both going to graduate school in the same city. We were both looking for apartments. She found a roommate and went to visit, a potential roommate went to visit her. And I noticed a sign on the apartment building across the way that said there was a room available. So I called the number. Turns out that Joe was the father-in-law of the person who owned the building. So they told me to wait at his place until they got there. That gave me some time to chat with Joe. And one of the things I noticed on his bookcase was a book about Scott, which is a German card game that I happen to play, but very few Americans do. He was so excited that I played Scott that he immediately gave me the book, which he had written, as well as a book on cribbage, which he had also written, and invited me to play Scott with him and his buddies. I should let you know at the time he was 78, and he was the youngest of the buddies that played Scott. I think the oldest was about 90. And I have never seen such good card players in all my life. We played 16 times 3 hands in a couple of hours. And when we got all done, these guys who were in their 70s, 80s, and about 90 recalled for me all the mistakes I had made in every one of the hands we played that night. Amazing card players, a great time playing with Joe and his buddies. But this random event of running into Joe because my wife-to-be was visiting a potential roommate who happened to have an apartment that was across from a building that had a vacancy, and there was going to be some delay before the landlord could get there, and there just happened that their father-in-law lived in the building, and I had a half-hour conversation with him while I waited, and then I got to go play Scott with him and his friends. It seemed like just a random life event that put all of those things together and shaped at least that experience in my life. It turns out I'm not the only person who thinks about what if it had been different. In fact, I think about this a little bit too often. If I just get through a stoplight and I'm the last car through, or I just fail to get through the stoplight and I'm the first one stopped waiting for the red, I say, okay, I'm 30 seconds different because of that one small change. That's going to change the cars I pass, the people I meet, what time I'm here and there. It could have a dramatic effect. I'll never know what it would have been like had my life been shifted by 30 seconds a different direction. Turns out I'm not the only one who thinks about these random life events. In fact, there are 3 interesting movies that have slightly different takes on this. Blind Chance by Kieslowski from 1987 details a main character, you see him here dashing for a train, and in the 3 versions of the story, played one after the other in the movie, he catches the train one time, he misses the train one time, and he misses the train and runs into a police officer the 3rd time. And based on those 3 things, when he runs into the police officer, he gets upset, he gets thrown in jail, and he meets some people there. On the train, he meets somebody and his life goes a different direction. And when he fails to make the train, but he doesn't run into the police officer, he runs into somebody on the platform. And so the different people that he meets because of that slightly different event of trying to run and catch a train have an impact on the way his life plays out. Run Lola Run is a similar movie from 1998. It's in German. Lola rennt is the original title. If you haven't seen this movie and you watch it, I encourage you to watch it in German. There's not actually that much language, but the film works much better in German. Even though the actress speaks both English and German and did her own dubbing, it's still much better in the original German language. And Sliding Doors, which interestingly came out the same year. Sliding Doors has an extra wrinkle in it. In both Blind Chance and Lola rennt, the scenarios play back to back. So you see one of the events and then all the things that lead from that. And then you go back to the beginning and it comes out slightly differently and you see all the things that follow from that. And then you go back to the beginning and do it again and see all of the things that follow. In Sliding Doors, there are only 2 scenarios, not 3, but they play simultaneously through each other. You keep going back and forth between the 2 scenarios. There's even a scene where the 2 versions of the character can be seen at the same time. It's handy that in one scenario, she dyes her hair. So she's got 2 different colors of hair and you can identify which of her is which as the story goes along. Anyway, all 3 are interesting movies that think about this idea of a random life event and how it impacts you going forward. I won't play this. If I had time, I might have, but I think I'm going to move on. You can find this online, the interesting couple of minutes where she either misses or doesn't miss a subway train. All right, a little bit more mathematics. Sierpinski triangles, except these are not your usual Sierpinski triangles. They're slightly different in the way that I constructed them. In fact, they're not the same. In fact, they're so not the same, there's not a single dot on the left that's in the triangle on the right. They're completely different in that sense, although at a high level, they look identical. And the way I made these was to play something called a chaos game. In this particular version of the chaos game, I started at the lower left corner of the triangle. And at each step, I randomly picked one of the corners of the triangle and moved halfway to that corner and put down a dot. And then from that position, moved halfway toward a randomly chosen corner and put down a dot. And then again and again and again. In fact, there are 50,000 dots in these pictures. The first 14 of them are shown here along with the path that you take to get there. And it's not too hard to show that there's actually exactly one way to get to each point in the Sierpinski triangle by this method, which means if you take a different first step, as I did on the left and the right, all of the 50,000 points on the left will be different from all of the 50,000 points on the right, aside from the first one where I started. Nevertheless, you get essentially the same picture from these very different random outcomes of the chaos game. All right, so a lot of little stories and anecdotes. I want to pull some of these together to think about some bigger questions about randomness. And here's my first big question. Does God use randomness to achieve his purposes? And if we think back about the Sierpinski triangle that we had just a moment ago, suppose my purpose was to make something that resembled a Sierpinski triangle. And I did it playing this chaos game. Even though I have no foreknowledge about any of the individual random choices that are going to be made in the production of this pseudo Sierpinski triangle, I know with certainty that it's going to look roughly like it looks. For my purposes, this random process produces exactly what I want, a version of the Sierpinski triangle, without me having to control the particular choices that I made. So my question here is it the same way with randomness in the natural world and randomness in our lives? Does God use randomness to achieve his purposes? There's some follow-up questions to that. You could answer the first question either yes or no. Let's suppose you say it does. So God does use randomness to achieve his purposes. Does that, should that, could that change how we think about God or ourselves compared to if we didn't think so? And if we don't think so, then why do random models do such a good job of explaining so many things? If they aren't really random, why is it that randomness as a mathematical model is effective in doing genetics, in figuring out transmissions of disease, and in so many other things in the sciences? So these are big and pretty hard questions. And then maybe a meta question, which is, does it matter? Does it matter how God relates to what, at least to us, appears to be random? Does it matter whether it's truly random and God has somehow baked randomness into the universe, or whether it's actually completely determined by God, but just appears to be random to us? If they're not random, then the interesting question is why they seem to behave as if they are. And there are potential answers you could give. For example, a former colleague of mine, now retired, David Laverelle, used to talk about the mediation of Christ and the fact that this holding all things together of Christ was basically making the world more livable for humans. And perhaps having things appear to be random, which lets us do genetics and do our random models, makes the world a more livable place for humans and makes it more understandable for us, even though perhaps it's not really random. Of course, it does leave you with some awkward questions, including why didn't God make a different choice at this particular or that particular moment along the way, especially when a particularly negative consequence may have happened from a particular random outcome. On the other hand, if things really are random, how do we interpret various events? So think about some things that you might think of as random or apparently random. Let's take lots, casting lots. At my church, we cast lots for elders and deacons after a slate of nominees has been chosen by the congregation and the elders and deacons. At a former church I was at, we had an interesting little rule. It was a church that had a lot of graduate students in it. And so we had a requirement that at least one person on the elder team and on the deacon team, actually this was before we were a formal church, so it was one person on what was called the core team had to be a student. And when we were putting the rules together for this, I asked an interesting question that led us to an interesting conversation with a few of us, which was, will we force this? If we get down to the last choice from the slate of nominees and a student has not yet been chosen, will we get rid of all the non-students and choose from among the students who remain? Or will we make rules about the nomination list and let the randomness usually select a student? Or will we make the nomination list and assume that if God wants a student there, he'll pick a student? So how you think about lots and casting lots, say for elders and deacons in your church, can be impacted by how you think about randomness and whether these choices are being made on an individual, specific, purposeful, moment by moment level by God, or whether they're the outcomes of some random processes that were built into the system. Same thing with coincidences, like running into Joe Wergen and spending a half hour with him, or the other coincidences that have shaped our lives in small and big ways. Or insurance. There are some people that object to insurance, but most of the people that I know, even Christians, purchase insurance, which is based entirely on things like actuarial tables and probabilities of various people having this or that event that could cost the insurance company money. And that's how your policy rates are set for you. So how do you interpret those sorts of events? When you get in an automobile accident or the house is on fire or something is stolen, are those purely random events? Or is God involved in those in some different sort of a way? And then finally, a third question, this gets back to the movies. How much are we shaped by random things that happen in our lives? The three movies have different answers to this question. And I won't spoil the movies for those of you who haven't seen them. But the main question is, despite these random changes, are you essentially the same person and you will get to that same person regardless of what happens to you? Or are you completely the product of all these random things that happen to you? And so if something happens slightly differently, you would have been a different person. A person that, because you only have one version of yourself to see and not the 2 or 3 that are in the movie, that you'll never know and nobody else will either. A very interesting question, one that I think is hard to answer, but fun to think about. And then I put a picture here. These are twins. There are several twins like this. I think National Geographic had an article about a pair of American twins where one was black and one was white. So the parents were one black and one white, non-identical twins. One of whom looked much more like the mother, the other much more like the father. In terms of the genetics of the situation, we model this as a random thing, basically a coin toss. But in terms of the way this impacts the lives of these people, especially in certain countries, it could make an enormous impact on them, this one random thing. So it's certainly possible that these things we call random could have a very big impact on our lives and the kinds of people we become. And then the question is, well, what is the source of that randomness? And how is it that God is involved with that randomness shaping us as people, as individuals? All right, time for a thought experiment. This is a blank slide because you've got to do this all in your mind. This is a thought experiment that I have occasionally done with students. I'll admit it's a little bit contrived, but it's maybe not impossible. But it will help you think through what your knee-jerk gut reaction is to some of the questions I've been asking. So let's suppose it's late at night, the telephone rings, it's somebody calling from the hospital. They're informing you that someone that's close to you, it could be a family member or a friend, but in any case, somebody for whom you need to make medical decisions has been in a car accident and they want you to come to the hospital right away. So you do that, you go to the hospital. When you get there, you find out that the situation is not too good. In fact, there's been an injury to an internal organ that is crucial and unrepairable. And the only hope is to find, and very quickly, a donor who can provide that organ. It's got to be a donor that matches. And the doctors basically tell you the chances are not good that such a donor can be found in time. And they want you to be prepared for that. A little while later, the doctor comes in again and says, well, I have some news for you. There's been another accident. There is another person who is injured. It turns out they are a compatible donor, but it turns out they have an injury to a different organ. And so they could donate to your friend or a relative, but just as well, your friend or relative could donate an organ to that person. The other family has offered to flip a coin for it. Who's the donor and who's the recipient? So my questions are, first of all, do you accept the offer to flip the coin? And I won't let you off the hook too easily. If you say, no, we should really be the donors, then I'll just turn it around and say to you, what if both families are willing to be the donors? Now you need to flip to see who gets to be the recipient. Would you flip if there's no other good way to make the decision? And then the even bigger question is, let's suppose the coin toss comes out in your favor. Do you thank God for the coin toss? What if it doesn't come out in your favor? Do you think God made an individual specific decision to make the coin turn out a particular way, or did he just let the random probabilities play out the way they do? At one level, this doesn't matter. The coin toss will be the same outcome one way or the other. The donor and recipient will be chosen. The surgery will be performed. But it does matter in the sense that we might feel very differently about it, depending on how we think about the random outcome of that coin toss. All right, so a few parting thoughts as we conclude here. I should mention that this thinking goes back to my childhood, but thinking about it more in a more focused way goes back to two events. One of them was the reading group that I mentioned earlier, and the second was being asked to write a chapter for a book called Delight in Creation, where a number of scientists and by extension mathematicians, statisticians, were asked to write a short chapter. And the way it was pitched to me at the time was to write something about your discipline that you wish your pastor knew. And I decided to write about randomness. 2 years later, I had written an article of 8 or 10 pages. It was the longest, hardest per word article I think I've ever written, trying to figure out how to write that. And one of the things that maybe is clear to you, but might not be clear to the typical pastor, is something that I wanted to make sure was clear in my article. And that's that most scientists who use randomness in their models are doing so simply because their random models work, not because they have any particular philosophical or theological position. That's not to say that there aren't scientists who think deeply about theological and philosophical things. There are. But on a day-to-day basis, they're mainly doing it because it works. And there are many who use randomness without thinking terribly hard about the philosophical or theological consequences of what they're doing at all. But this is important because there are some people who have a natural disinclination or uncomfortableness with randomness. And I didn't want people to think that people who are using randomness in their daily lives to do work, to model diseases and genetics and various things, were doing anything that should be thought of suspiciously. Second thing is that randomness can be used creatively and to achieve desired ends. So we saw that in the game design that I did as a kid, introducing holding a hand into games like Sorry, or Joe hiding the fives in a game like cribbage, changing the percentages of getting various outcomes, changing the game in a way that changed the strategy, but didn't determine any particular cards or any particular outcomes. You can think about algorithm design, probabilistic algorithms, or more recently, quantum computation. All of these probabilistic and quantum computation algorithms involve using probability advantageously. Or perhaps genetics. And here's another thought experiment. Most of us have 5 fingers. That's the usual number of fingers for a person to have. Is that because God created people intentionally to have 5 fingers? Or did he set up the randomness and genetics so that people of some sort similar to what we are were likely to happen, but we might have had 4 fingers or 6 fingers and that would have been just fine too. And we just happened to have 5 fingers. In any case, like with a Sierpinski triangle, you can set things up randomly to achieve a certain outcome, at least if you're willing to say that the outcome is a class of outcomes that are all equal from your perspective, even though in the minutiae, they're not identical. Third, allowing a role for randomness does not preclude a role for God. And this is a hard thing for some people, but I think personifying chance does not bring any clarity to the discussion. And setting up God versus chance, sort of the XOR, borrowing from computer science, God exclusive or chance, is not the right way to go. Rather than make that sort of a statement, I think we need to ask the question, is it God via chance? Does God use chance to achieve his purposes? But I don't see any reason why chance should preclude the action of God. And then finally, I strongly prefer symmetric interpretations of randomness and warn against interpreting good consequences or good outcomes one way and bad ones a different way. So attributing it to God when it's good and attributing it to noise when it's bad, that to me seems contrived. But it's very easy to selectively choose our interpretations based on the situation. So where do I come down after all of this? I don't think it's easy to know for sure what's going on. But it doesn't seem to be, to me anyway, to be theologically unsound or impossible to imagine a world where God actually created and built randomness in. That would explain why random models work so well, because the things they're modeling actually are random. And it doesn't preclude God achieving his purposes that way. And it seems to resonate with the way I perceive the world. Furthermore, it actually would be pretty hard to spoof randomness without doing randomness. If you imagine that every outcome is chosen in the minutiae, but it's chosen in such a way that it looks indistinguishable for randomness. First, it's hard to do, and B, it puts a great constraint on God that's maybe as big as the other sorts of constraints that you might not like to put on God. Anyway, I want to conclude here. There'll be a chance for questions if people have them. Thank you for listening. I want to thank the people that I've talked to over the years about this, and especially those who've gone through some of the frustrations with me where I've tried to come to better, firmer answers than I've been able to. I want to let you know that the slides are available if you want to see them again at the link that's given there. A lot of what's in the slides, but not all of what's in the slides, goes back to an article that I wrote, or a chapter that I wrote in the book, Delight in Creation. That was then reformatted into a 3-part blog on the Biologos site. And so you can find that in either of those two locations. At the ministry theorem location, there's also a bit of a reading list at the end if you want to read more about randomness and various philosophical and theological thoughts about randomness. There's another article that came out shortly after mine called Randomness and God's Nature. It's by Jim Bradley, whom some of you might know from involvement in this group over the years. I actually wanted to put a different link here, but for some reason I couldn't find it. I thought there was a site that he had put together when he had a Templeton grant about randomness and various groups involved with that did things related to randomness. And perhaps we can locate that and send it to the ACMS mailing list, but I wasn't able to locate it by Googling. I did stumble across, as I was Googling, however, a new book that I had not seen before, God's Providence and Randomness in Nature, Scientific and Theological Perspectives. I think it came out in 2019. And if any of you have read that, I'd love to see you chat or let me know individually what you thought of the book and whether it's a book that I need to read. With that, I'll open it up to questions. And again, sorry we can't go for dinner, but I hope you enjoyed your dinner talk.
Well, Randy, first, thanks so much for your presentation. And in fact, there have been some questions that have been raised, and I'll try to do my best job in moderating. So you have two ways that you can offer questions at this point. You can put them in the Q&A. You could also potentially put them in the chat to the panelists directly, and we'll try to moderate as we go. So I have this one you may want to respond to first. And the question is, how do you resolve omniscience with using randomness?
So first of all, I'll say that this is in a large set of questions that have the general form of how do you resolve this with that come up when you have these discussions about randomness. Free will comes up, good and evil, and whether God causes evil comes up, all those sorts of things. And now, sorry, I've forgotten, what were the particular two that were in your question again?
Omniscience and randomness.
So I think maybe the Sierpinski triangles is a good thing to think about. What did I know? Not that I'm omniscient, but just as a baby example, what did I know before I created those triangles? Well, what I did not know was which way the first step was going to go, or the second step, or any other step in the process. What I did know was what it was going to look like when it was all done. I didn't have to try these over and over again to make sure I got a good one for the slides. I knew the first one I tried was going to work, and the second one was going to look just like it to the resolution of slides on a screen. So it's possible to set things up random and have sure knowledge about a sense of the outcome of those things. Or maybe we can go back to my story about the coin toss and flipping a coin over here. By the way, if you're really curious to know, that coin came up tails. So now you know it's not random for you anymore either. From your perspective, until a moment ago, that was something unknowable. From my perspective, it was knowable. It's not clear to me how God relates to time. So we perceive time in this very linear fashion, and you either are before the coin toss or after the coin toss, and you're either before the big reveal or you're after the big reveal. But if you imagine that God doesn't interact with time that way and sees all of time all at once, you could know all the outcomes of all the random things, even though they were random. So again, these are hard questions. I don't know how you prove that it is that way, but at least it's a way we could imagine it being that doesn't preclude God being omnipotent and at any moment knowing what's going to happen, past, present, or future, and still having those things having been random in the moment that they happened.
Great, thank you. Before I get to another question, point of personal privilege, I guess someone asked if you could stop sharing the screen. I presumably will allow us to be somewhat bigger for those of us that are pictured.
I can try.
Someone else, thank you. Someone else asked if a recording will be available of this talk, and we are recording it. And I believe that Kristen is clarifying with Joel whether a link can be obtained, and if so, we will send it out. So that was the response to that one. So another question that was in our Q&A line, and I'll go back to the chat line. Should quantum mechanics influence our answers to the questions you've been raising?
So yes and no. I think that anybody who wants to think theologically or philosophically about randomness has an obligation to also think, at least to some amount, mathematically and scientifically about randomness. Or you're likely to say silly things. And in fact, with that reading group that we had among the faculty, we spent a lot of time just talking to each other about what we knew about randomness from the perspective of philosophy, or from theology, or from quantum mechanics, or from genetics, or from statistics, or from probability. So yeah, I think all of these things should be involved. It gets trickier when you try and figure out how they're involved. And like I said, I feel like there's not a methodology here. At least I don't know what the methodology is to really answer the question and know you're done. I don't think we're going to prove a mathematical theorem that will settle the matter once and for all time. It's going to be more like philosophy and theology, where people argue and discuss and revise, but there's not ever a final answer to the question. But certainly any good answer is going to take into account things like quantum mechanics and how they work. Not that we really understand how quantum mechanics works. I mean, really all we have is a model for quantum mechanics. We can explain or predict things, but it's a lot harder to understand what's actually going on.
Okay, thank you. And before I shift over to the chat to pick up some other questions, I'm going to clean out the ones on the Q&A. Actually, I'll offer my own that I had, and that was, where would you put Scrabble on the continuum of these games, since you know we do a fair amount of that together. I have a suspicion, but I'll let you answer that. But the other question that's on the Q&A line is, does this relate to slow manifolds? I'm not sure the context. It was put in about halfway through your talk, so I'm not sure if you can pick the context, but the question is, does it relate to slow manifolds?
So I think the second one is going to be easy for me to answer because I don't think I know what slow manifolds are, so I probably can't offer a very good answer. Regarding Scrabble, it's certainly in the middle area. It's not chess and it's not Candyland. There's the randomness of the tiles that you get. It certainly also has a strategic element. You can tell a game has strategic elements to it if good players win more often than bad players, and you can tell the good players from the bad players. On the other hand, it's a good game because I can play Dave, even though he's much better than I am, and I win sometimes because I do get lucky letters once in a while.
So my question is, would it be closer to the cribbage on the chess side or on the Candyland side? But maybe that's
Yeah, I would say closer to cribbage.
yeah, fair enough. And this came up in the chat line and also was repeated here, and it saved me looking it up. I have my Bible here just handy, and they're wondering about your interpretation of Proverbs 16 verse 33, which, just in case you don't have the verse in front of you, my version says the lot is cast into the lap, but its every direction is from the Lord. And that's roughly what it says there too.
Yeah, so I knew that that was going to be the verse, and I thought somebody might bring it up. I almost preemptively put it in the slides. A couple of things there. One is that it's a little bit hard to know how far this should be generalized. There, of course, were mandated times when people were supposed to cast lots, and the Urim and the Thummim and all those sorts of things. There were also things like the sailors casting lots to decide to throw Jonah overboard. But I'm not sure that that one verse is really meant to be a technical description of how randomness works. And it's an interesting question to know whether occasionally God intervenes to make a particular coin toss come out a particular way. So that would be different from my models of they're all just random, and the model where they're all predetermined, they just look like they're random to us. This idea that hidden amongst the millions and billions of random events, there are a few that are so important that God intervenes to make sure they come out just so. Again, I don't know how you would know for sure that it's not that, although it's hard to hide determinism inside randomness. It has to be a small amount and carefully done to make that work. But I will say that, again, you can use randomness to be directive without determining the results. And so I don't see it as being a complete slam dunk for the deterministic view of things to have that verse there. So I saw a follow-up here in the chat. Now that I'm not sharing my screen, I can see the chat too, which I couldn't see while I was sharing my screen. So slow manifolds are dynamical systems that are resilient to small perturbations. One of the slides I almost included something related to that, this sensitive dependence to initial conditions, which is one of the ways that apparent randomness can occur. And it goes against the sort of Laplacian determinism where you would, if you could know everything, you could know all the future just by propagating things out. But it turns out that if we can't know things precisely, there's no amount of imprecision that we can get by with in some of these systems. I don't know that it's directly or specially related, except that it's another example of something that we perceive as random because we can't predict what the unpredictable type of randomness. We can't predict how the outcomes are going to come, but we can model the probabilities with which various things will happen.
And there are two chats that follow it, which have questions that you can read. I'll give you a chance to read them. And while you're doing that, I'll also note that Jim Bradley is in attendance. And I think there was a point along the way where you weren't sure about a particular citation. So maybe he can chat in the details.
Yeah, so in case Jim wasn't on when I mentioned it, looking for a link, if it still exists, to the materials that were produced by your Templeton grant.
Okay.
Which I had a hard time finding today.
And so if you have the chat line, you should see the two that follow the one you just replied to. Those are the remaining questions I don't think we've addressed.
All right. So in teaching statistics, I've been thinking about instances such as the casting of lots in the Bible, selecting of Judas and Jonah, when a task that otherwise would be random in outcome was sovereignly determined to indicate truth, God's will. When should we expect God to do this? Yeah, so this is a hard question. It's probably not our place to expect these things. I'm not sure that that's our role. That's maybe in the category of it's not ours to know the hour and the day. Again, I think some of these things are more problematic if you imagine God traveling with us through time instead of imagining a God who has a different relationship to time. You know, if the beginning of in the beginning was the beginning of time, but God was there doing it, then he existed before time. Either that or there was time before the beginning. It all gets very confusing to me. And I certainly don't preclude the idea that God could intervene. I mean, he may do, or God may do what God wants to do. But I also have a hard time imagining that God is just picking every little roll of the dice when I play Settlers of Catan with my kids. It somehow doesn't feel quite right that way either.
Thanks. There is one question that follows it. It looks like Jim Bradley has now responded in the chat line, has given some detail. And then Kristen Cammingham note that there is a link to your slides for this talk if they want to access the various recommendations you had at the end, either for movies or for some of the articles to follow up. So the remaining question is the one, what about the view that God just created the physical laws and does not intervene much afterwards?
So I think this is probably the idea that, okay, the model was created, randomness involved, and now we don't need God anymore because everything is just happening. And it doesn't have to all be deterministic. Maybe some of it is random, but it's still the same sort of clockwork universe where it was made and wound and now God's out of the picture. I'll say that that's not how I feel. That's different from saying in a deep theological or philosophical way how things are. And maybe I do just live with this tension of feeling like random things really are random and feeling like God's involved. And I don't know exactly how it works. I remember at the very beginning, I said it's a very frustrating thing to think about because I don't know how to test these hypotheses. You know, what data do I collect? What do I do to know exactly how it plays out? So I don't have a very good answer there, I think.
Fair enough. I think those are the questions we had. So once again, thank you so much, Randy, for your presentation. And we will do what we can to make it available. That is the recording. The slides have already been put in one of the chat lines. Jim Bradley did send something to the panelists and noted that there is not an online list of the results produced by the Templeton Grant, but there is one book that came from it that he recommends. It's by Abraham Dice, edited by Carl Giberson, Oxford University Press. So,
I think Abraham's Dice is the title.
Oh, sorry, Abraham's Dice is the title. Sorry, Abraham's Dice is the title. I'm sure you can get it from there, Oxford University Press.
Thanks, Jim.
Very good.
And I don't feel so bad about not being able to find the site if it doesn't exist.
So thank you all for coming. And note that look for updates perhaps from me by way of a recording link, but down the road, if you have any nominations for the board, please send them to me and I will bring them to the membership subcommittee, and be looking for emails in August that will ask you to submit a proposal for a talk for next year's conference. We do hope to have an in-person JMM reception next year with the speaker, so please join us for that too. So thank you all for coming.